Before I get started with my presentation, I'd like to thank DPRI Director Nakakata and Professor Matsushima for their kind introduction, and to the DPRI faculty for conferring this honor on me. I noted that the first awardee was Professor Hiro Kanamori of the California Institute of Technology. I was a visiting associate at Caltech for quite a few years while I was a disaster manager with the California Office of Emergency Services, and got to know Professor Kanamori very well. And it's certainly an honor for me to stand with Professor Kanamori and the other fine scholars who have received this award. I'd also like to acknowledge my frequent collaborator, friend, and colleague, Professor Katsuya Yomori, at whose invitation I first came to DPRI about 7 years ago. This is my fourth long-term stay in Japan, and it's to his credit that I'm here and standing before you. So thank you very much for your long-term collaboration. I'd also like to say that today's lecture is based on a study that Professor Yomori and I did over this long period of pandemic, and reflects our views not only of the pandemic, but also of the global climate crisis. I'd also acknowledge my wife, Eileen, who's been with me these 4 years in Japan, and I certainly appreciate her being here, and this is truly an honor. Thank you. So I'd like to first begin my presentation by saying that this is from a social science and disaster management perspective. I make no claims of expertise in climate science or necessarily in public health, but this is the story of how disasters have been defined traditionally, and perhaps how they should change based on our current situation. So my lecture is entitled Disasters Without Borders, the Coronavirus Pandemic, Global Climate Change, and the Gradual Onset and the Ascendancy of Gradual Onset Disasters. My objectives in this lecture are to present a critique of the traditional sociological concepts of how disasters are defined. And we looked at 4 borders, as we called them. These borders include the temporal, the spatial, phasing, and positioning. I'm going to discuss the implications of the traditional concept for policy and public perception, make an argument for the inclusion of gradually occurring processes or disasters, and focus on the coronavirus pandemic and global climate change and other gradually occurring disasters. Social science disaster research dates back at least 100 years. The Fritz definition is one of the earliest and most conceptually clear. Charles Fritz was an American sociologist who did much of his work in the early part of the 20th century. In 1961, Fritz defined disaster as an event concentrated in time and space in which a society or a relatively self-sufficient subdivision of a society undergoes severe danger and incurs such losses that the social structure is disrupted. Later refinements distinguished between human-caused disasters, war, terrorism, collective violence, technological, that include explosions, nuclear accidents, chemical releases into the environment, and natural disasters, the ones that we're perhaps more familiar with: earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, tornadoes, and landslides, for example. Later justifications for a more circumscribed definition came from other scholars, including Henry Quarantelli I believe in a publication that he and Perry defined disasters, saying that we are inclined to exclude from the concept of disaster all very diffused events, including traditional droughts and famines and certain kinds of epidemics. It's best to think of the concept of disaster as an occasion involving immediate crisis or emergency. Quarantelli and Perry argued that gradual onset events create a kind of murkiness. The concise definitions of disaster and empirical generalizations based on such concepts are ill-equipped to analyze. The solution was, to exclude them from consideration and designate them social problems rather than disasters. So, in summarizing the assumptions of this traditional paradigm, disasters occur rapidly in time, in a temporal framework of seconds to a few days. Disasters occur in a well-circumscribed geographical area, that is, with identifiable boundaries. Disasters can be conceptualized as cycling through phases, including preparedness, response, mitigation, and recovery. Disasters and their cycles are clear and predictable, with each phase being characterized by specific actions to alleviate the impact of the disaster event. And finally, public policy and legislation prescribing specific institutional responsibilities and actions reflect this paradigm. First, the temporal border. And of course, this refers to the timing of a disaster. Disasters, according to the traditional definition, are events, occurrences that disrupt the normal functioning of society. Rapidly occurring disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, flooding, and landslides, though they differ in duration, can be temporally parameterized, occurring in seconds to a few days. Excluded are droughts, famines, epidemics, and climate change, disasters that are lengthy in duration or endemic. Recent works in the social sciences have argued for a more temporally diffuse concept, or an abandonment of the temporal border in favor of a view of disasters as processes that reflect or expose broader societal issues, including inequality and racism. Second, the spatial border. The second border is spatial or geo-limited, as Fritz conceptualizes it at the societal and more typically regional or localized level. The spatial dimension refers not only to disaster in general, but to all considerations of zoning as a means of population protection. Spatial borders can be conceptualized on two levels. The first characterize the disaster agents themselves as geographically confined or diffuse, and second, delimit zones defined for countermeasures to warn, mitigate, and prepare for disaster. The latter have a mixed record of success due to the inherent uncertainty of zoning. Uchiyama, for example, and others have noted that flood and landslide maps in Japan have, on the whole, accurately predicted casualties from these hazards. On the other hand, Katada reported that 65% of the fatalities in the Great East Japan earthquake induced tsunami were outside the mapped tsunami inundation zones. Robert Geller also observed that most of the earthquakes in Japan since 1979 that have caused 10 or more deaths were in areas designated as lower in seismic vulnerability. The essential point here is not to deny the efficacy of hazard zone in general, but to point out that globally occurring disasters cannot be confined geographically. That is, not to say that hotspots for the pandemic infection or coastal zones with greater vulnerability to the effects of global climate change cannot be identified. The globalization of disaster and the need for a comprehensive multinational policy of mitigation seriously challenges nation states that differ in wealth, in culture, in government configurations, and alliances. I think we're all familiar with this type of diagram, the disaster management cycle. It's related to the temporal border, of course, but it indicates the way in which we have traditionally perceived disasters as having occurred. That there is a preparedness stage that includes planning and warning, a response that can be both pre-impact mobilization and post-impact emergency response. Recovery is sometimes divided into early restoration of essential services and longer-term rebuilding of housing and infrastructure. Mitigation consists of actions and attitudes that eliminate or reduce the impact of future hazards. It's been a standard model, for both academic study and disaster management programs. I know that in my experience as a disaster manager in California, the agency that I work for had programs and divisions devoted to these specific cycles, these specific elements within the disaster cycle. If we define disaster more broadly to include gradually occurring hazards, the assumption of clearly defined phases becomes opaque and breaks down at several points. Of the current pandemic, we can say in regard to phasing, despite the precedent of earlier global pandemics, warnings and preparedness were few and inadequate. Responses failed to stop the rapid spread of the disease. Given the nature of periodic surges, it was never entirely clear whether we were responding or recovering from the disease. With the coronavirus pandemic, we've observed ambiguity in the length of response and recovery cycles, as demonstrated in this diagram. And the lack of clarity to what phase prevails at any given point. Perhaps a similar diagram could be constructed for global climate change, demonstrating how warning has changed the environmental baselines on which disasters occur. And by altering the baselines, I mean how climate change exacerbates the frequency and severity of rapidly occurring disasters, and how the gradual changes associated with climate change lead to a kind of normalization in public perception, allowing policymakers to continue regarding the slow onset processes as non-disasters. Policies and institutions focused on disaster as an event will not effectively address what are long-term processes. The other border that we've discussed is positioning, involving public policy and role players. And by positioning, we're referring to the many stakeholders, both public and private, that demand action to mitigate the effects of gradual onset disasters, those who have vested interest in the status quo, government officials who must navigate these demands or changes or against change, and the experts who are called upon to define the situation. These gradually occurring disasters create dilemmas for policymakers. Mitigation measures may require difficult trade-offs. They may require confrontation with entrenched interests. There's a tendency to deal with rapidly occurring secondary disasters. Not always easy to identify the appropriate experts. In terms of experts, in my experience as a disaster manager, we knew experts who could analyze the latest major earthquake, or the structural engineer who could diagnose systems that failed in an earthquake. And there may not be easy for the media to identify who the actual experts are in some gradually occurring disasters. So the complexities of comprehensive response may lead to a kind of back burner for the issue of global climate change and other kinds of gradually occurring disasters. I'd like to take a minute to talk about how the prevailing paradigm has shaped public policy in the US. In the US, the Stafford Act defines how government agencies respond and recover from disasters. The Stafford Act defines the responsibilities of various levels of government in disaster, which are assumed to be rapidly occurring. Agencies such as the one I work for have divisions dedicated to specific rapidly occurring disasters. The US states have major roles in response to disaster within their borders, while response is first a local function. The states are the primary managers of mutual aid and have branches for many rapid onset disasters to which these states are vulnerable, and programs reflecting the standard disaster management cycle: preparedness, warning, mitigation, and recovery. For most disasters, there are known experts upon whom response and recovery agencies rely in repeated disasters of the same type. And finally, our disaster governance is skewed to address rapidly occurring disasters, not the ones that have the greatest long-term impacts. We're still in the process of sorting out responsibilities and obligations for climate and pandemic impacts globally. Earlier this year, Pakistan experienced catastrophic flooding. Drought in the Horn of Africa brought about food scarcity and starvation. Hurricanes in the Dominican Republic created havoc. All of these disasters were intensified by global climate change, prompting the question, what obligation do the wealthy nations that are major contributors to greenhouse gases that fuel climate change have to the poor nations that contribute very little and are basically climate change victims. For the first time, the recent UN Climate Summit, the EU and the US finally committed to creation of a fund to assist developing nations' response to more frequent and intense rapid disasters exacerbated by climate change. Whether other wealthy countries will join has yet to be seen. This is a matter of environmental justice. So in assessing the impacts of gradual onset disasters, another potential border is the assessment of disaster impacts, which traditionally include the number of casualties, population displacement, property damage, and social and economic impacts on the affected region. To some extent, similar statistics can be compiled for slowly occurring disasters. For example, the coronavirus has now caused 6.6 million fatalities worldwide and 633 million infections. But the gradual onset disasters we now face require new metrics: loss of habitat, marked increase in secondary disasters, climate reparations. Fatalities will continue to accumulate for years and perhaps decades. Recovery will be less salient than accommodation and adaptation. It'll become difficult to disaggregate losses caused by disasters secondary to the main ongoing processes. It'll also be difficult to prevent them from becoming a kind of new normal. So the implications of the current paradigm are, in our judgment, the following. It's skewed toward rapidly occurring natural disasters. The gradually occurring disasters, droughts, famines, epidemics, climate change are poorly modeled under this paradigm, and the consequences may be having relatively low visibility, both historically and contemporaneously, as in a new normal. Having low salience in terms of public perception and policy, receiving lesser attention from scholars and research funding sources, being more difficult to respond to and recover from, failing to gain the attention of relief agencies and foundations, and underestimating the complexities of the ongoing disasters. We should expand the paradigm to incorporate these gradually occurring events. I've compiled some headlines from recent newspapers, the New York Times and the Japan Times, that to some degree reflect what I've said in this lecture. Note that in the upper right-hand corner, the next COVID wave could be the largest yet, is not from 2020, not from 2021, it's from November of 2022. So we're still living with this pandemic. I mean, all of us standing here, sitting here with masks on is one very obvious indication that we're still in the middle of this pandemic. We also in the United States recently had a midterm election, and pollsters typically like to determine what are the basic issues that move people at the polls. And one headline indicated that climate change is eclipsed by inflation, the Supreme Court decision on abortion, and many other more, quote, bread and butter issues. Climate change was well down the list. So the question is, are we going to be better prepared in the future for these long, ongoing disasters that are clearly the most salient that we're dealing with currently? So the conclusions I draw from our study is that the argument presented here is not merely a semantic one. Concepts and the definitions derived are powerful and capable of setting public agendas, which guide governments and address or ignore the hazard. One can understand the desire for conceptual clarity when disaster research was in its infancy, but that time has now passed. And one of the quotes that I think is particularly appropriate for this lecture and for the situation in which we find ourselves is one from early 20th century sociologist W.I. Thomas, who said, if a situation is divined as real, it becomes real in its consequences. And thus, I think our restriction of the paradigm to rapidly occurring disasters has consequences. The old paradigm of disaster has become a conceptual burden, limiting and unrealistic in our current confrontation with the pandemic and global climate crisis. A new paradigm must include gradually occurring disasters and policies that recognize the need for effective global cooperation and enforcement actions. Disasters are what DPRI is in the business of preventing. Not just some of them, but all of them, including the most difficult. That concludes my lecture. I would like to add a couple of slides, maybe just take another 5 minutes to talk a little bit about how this study and the current reason for my being in Japan came about. As I mentioned, the lecture is based on a paper that Professor Yamori and I wrote, beginning at the time where the coronavirus pandemic was certainly becoming acute back in early 2020. In order to try to understand better what was going on in terms of the pandemic, I was reading a book called Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World by Laura Spinney. I also picked up an interesting paper by Eric Su entitled, Must Disasters Be Rapidly Occurring? The Case for an Expanded Temporal Typology of Disaster, which was published in 2019. I was beginning to feel that a reconceptualization of disaster was needed when I received from Professor Yamori an interesting concept paper identifying the borders that I discussed in this lecture. And the paper was published last year in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Recently, the publisher contacted me and said that it now has had 2,000 downloads. So this will also be republished in a handbook for disaster research in Japan that'll be coming out late next year. And I wanted to just say a final note on our continuing collaboration. Our current study assesses the level of planning by municipal governments for a possible advisory or warning for a major earthquake from the Japan Meteorological Agency. We know that there are over 700 municipalities that are considered to be part of the Nankai region, 29 prefectures, and 139 jurisdictions, which are vulnerable both to earthquake and tsunami. And so we want to find out whether local jurisdictions have planned for this special contingency. And if they receive an advisory or warning, it's going to be a fairly low probability one. And from a scientific standpoint, there may be only a 5 to 10% chance that any potential precursory earthquake in that zone would result in a huge earthquake such as the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. However, as a disaster managers, we look more at the consequences rather than the low probabilities. And I think that no disaster manager wants to be confronted by a population that expects something to be done and nothing has. So we have also been granted a second year of funding. And in that second year, once we identify what level of planning has taken place and what the gaps are in planning, we hope to carry out a series of workshops in that region to increase the planning, increase the preparedness for this possible large earthquake. So with that, I'll conclude my lecture, and thank you very much for this honor today and for your kind attention. And I'll entertain any questions you might have.